Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Key Stage 5 free stream. Anaya, thank you for joining us already. So on time. Lovely to have you here with us again. And welcome to all of those who are new and joining us for the first time for this first stream on A Streetcar Named Desire. So we have moved on from Othello, and today we are going to be looking at A Streetcar Named Desire, particularly about the context around this that we need to know in order to get into and understand this play very well to the level you are expected at A level or even in university. These are the ideas we need to be thinking about. So just in case you are new, this is one of our My Edspace free streams for Key Stage 5 taking place all across this year. I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at My Edspace. I've been teaching Key Stage 5 for a long time. And as we are going through the year, we're going to be offering these deep dives and masterclasses on all topics A level, ideally covering the most common texts for all of the different exam boards over the time that we have. So we've done a 16 lesson course on Othello and Shakespeare in September and October. And all of those lessons are available on my channel. Eleanor Does English for you to access and you to use as you like. And then from now, we'll be starting another course on A Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams, one of the most famous texts of the 20th century written in English, and one of the core texts for modern drama. So one of the most common, I would say the absolutely most common text for modern drama for A level. So let's get started, shall we? I was just waiting a moment for people to join us if they were running a little bit late from other lessons or running home after school. So let's get into it. And because we have some new people here today, just to introduce myself, as I said, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at My Edspace. I'm teaching Key Stage 5 for our platform and for YouTube for free. All across this year, you'll be able to access this and you'll be able to come back at any time. A little bit about my background on that slide, but let's actually get into our do now and then the text itself. So let's get started with what you know about A-level literature, just to review if you have joined me before or if you are new, just so you know a little bit more about it. Then what do you know about A Streetcar Named Desire? And then what do you know about the American South? A couple of ideas there for you. Feel free to pop into the chat as we work. And then I will be able to answer any questions you have, to review your work itself, and to make sure everything that you need to know and that you are sharing with us is right and accurate and well developed for your A-level study or wherever you choose to apply this work. So for our first question, what do you know about A-level? We're going to get into this in a minute. But for A-level, it's likely you know some ideas like it's pretty in-depth. There's lots of reading and writing involved, even more so than at GCSE. There's this big beast of a topic called coursework, where you write a longer essay yourself like a research paper. There are much more discussions, and you get really deep into the different characters. You end up knowing so much about them as well. That may be all you know for now. We're going to look into a little bit more in a moment. Then next, what do you know about A Streetcar Named Desire? Well, It is a famous play. Most people know that, they recognize the name. They often also know that it's written by Tennessee Williams. It's a famous playwright from the South, who, though he was not himself from Tennessee, his father was, hence the nickname Tennessee. Him as a playwright. He also wrote Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, The Glass Menagerie, if you recognize those as well. You also may know that it's about the South, particularly about the American South. And you also may know it from the famous black and white movie starring Marlon Brando, starring Vivien Leigh. If you're a movie buff, you may recognize those names. Marlon Brando, who was the Godfather. Vivien Leigh, who is in so many different movies of the time, famous actress of kind of the golden age of Hollywood. And maybe you know it's a little bit about class. We're going to get into it, so if you know nothing about A Streetcar Named Desire at this point, that's absolutely fine. Then, what do you know about the American South? A couple of ideas may come to mind. Firstly, this idea of the Civil War, right? The Civil War and slavery. You may know a little bit about that from history class, for example, because especially if you've grown up in the English education system, you may have studied, for example, the American South in history class. You may also know ideas about what the temperature is like, right? The American South, very hot climate, very hot weather. Applicable for our text. You also may know something about the antebellum South, which means the South before the war, before the Civil War is what they mean by that, where we had, for example, Gone with the Wind, where we had plantations, where there was widespread enslavement, and they're in the elite levels of Southern society. There was this idea of Old South values, of debutantes, of this kind of upper echelon of society that relied on manners, big hoop skirts, Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind type thing. And they were viewed as this kind of old-fashioned gentility, or gentlemen and ladies who were very polite. Manners, etiquette was extremely important. Society was extremely important. And then you also might know something about some of the cities, like New Orleans, believed to be the birthplace of jazz, and one of the major cities, and in fact one of the oldest cities in the country, established by French settlers before the actual consolidation of the United States themselves. So this is what you might know a little bit about. Don't worry, because by the end of this lesson you will have so much more you know about these different topics. So what I have here and what you have in front of you is a little knowledge organizer for you, where we're going to be looking at a lot of different topics, as we often do in a context lesson, because there are lots of different factors we need to take into place or need to take into consideration when we're looking at how these different ideas influence and appear in a text. And also, for example, that first box, A-level key information that you need to know. So if this is your first video you're seeing of mine, then you might need to jot some ideas down here in order to know a little bit more about the exam that you're planning on taking and what study at this level looks like. We're also going to be looking at Tennessee Williams' biographical context, who he was and what his inspiration, his project might have been in writing this play at this specific time. The plot, setting, and characters of A Streetcar Named Desire. We're going to introduce the play today as well. And then also look at the old American South versus the new American South and how these are different and how this cultural class clash does form the foundations for the tension in the play as well. Now, a little bit of review for people who've been here before. Literature at A level is very different. At GCSE, you're often on such a time crunch that your study becomes much less like the study of English that appears at higher levels. You're memorizing quotations, you're memorizing poems, you're memorizing lines of argument, etc. At A level, if you like English and if you like studying literature, you return at this point to a much more natural, real version of English, which is reading texts, writing responses, and talking a lot about the texts themselves. So unlike GCSE, where your teacher is right about all of these different texts, and there are generally specific arguments like Macbeth is ambitious, Macbeth is guilty, Macbeth is destroyed, you get to have much more agency over that work and over that argument generation because these texts are so full of ideas for you to study. There's also less focus on one specific word. So the phrases, is this a dagger I see before me, or stars hide your fires, may be still ringing in your brain from GCSE. And though quotations are still absolutely necessary to talk about in A-level study, you don't just spend your time talking about one quotation. Instead, you draw quotations together into a pattern, and then you talk about the pattern and how that pattern develops across the text. There's also usually in GCSE an extract, or for example, in the case of your modern drama, there's a choice of questions. Here in A-level, there's very often no extract at all. And so there's not the same focus on one place in the text, but rather using one place in the text to talk about the whole text. And in each paragraph that you write, it's likely you're going to talk about many different places in the text all at once. And though there is an occasional looking or study of literary criticism at GCSE, so you might have a quotation from Priestley himself, or you might have a quotation about Lady Macbeth's character from a critic, it's very unlikely that you're reading whole books or whole articles about Lady Macbeth or the inspector. In A-level, that's much more what you're doing all of the time, is yes, you're reading the text itself, but you're also spending quite a lot of time reading around the topic, it's called, which means reading what material has been produced about Othello or about A Streetcar Named Desire since it came out. What do the experts say, in other words? As such, you become much more of an expert yourself, and in your essays, you're actually contributing to this history of people talking about this text and offering their opinions on it. It's much more opinion-based in A-level, as long as you can support your argument. There are far fewer right answers and many more grey areas that you need to be aware of and you need to be critical about in your writing. As I said, there are many more patterns, there's many more thematic and character-led ideas in terms of your argument. So in terms of deciding one interpretation of a character's motives, for example, Othello is jealous, and then thinking, well, he's actually not jealous of Desdemona, he's jealous of Iago or Cassio or the insiders in Venice. Hello, Puneet Darij. Thank you for joining us. And as I said, it's expectation you're reading criticism and you're doing your own independent study in places like coursework. Then the assessment objectives. So what are you actually being marked on for A-level? These are the assessment objectives for AQA, and Edexcel, which are the two most common and biggest exam specifications. If you notice, their language for their different assessment objectives, so the different parts that you're assessed on in an essay, are almost identical, if not verbatim the same phrasing. For example, AO1, you're expected to articulate informed, personal and creative responses to literary text using associated concepts and terminology and coherent, accurate written expression. That means that you are meant to develop your own lines of argument with obvious knowledge of the texts, and you're expected to include a lot of terminology into an essay that makes sense and that someone who doesn't know you can follow the line of argument, what you're trying to say, in other words. Then AO2 is following the same sort of guidelines as AO2 in GCSE, in that it is focusing on how writers are creating meaning. What devices, what symbols, what choices are they making to make you feel a certain way, to make you react a certain way, to give you a certain impression? It's all very well and good to talk about a specific literary device, for example, saying that there is a symbol in the text, but it's much more important to explain what that symbol is doing in the story and why that symbol is included the way it is. Then AO3 is understanding the significance and influence of the context in which literary texts are written and received. So that means not only thinking about the context and the environment in which the writer is writing, but also the audience. How would the audience react to this? Similarly, we need to think about how that audience is different than us and include our own reaction to the text's presentation. So we need to be aware of context, hence why we're doing context lesson first. AO4 is not assessed for this specific question because AO4 is about comparison. So it's only for your comparative points, which is almost entirely prose or poetry. And AO5 is explore literary texts informed by different interpretations. Those interpretations are criticism. So that means that you're being assessed on whether you know what people are saying about this text. And the expectation is that you are not only citing these opinions in, I would say, at least once a paragraph, but also that you are then saying, this person supports my argument, here's why, rather than just sprinkling it in and saying, hey, look, can you see that I've done this? But incorporating it into your own work. This is what the question looks like. And for A level, the text is, or the questions are slightly different, but the fact that they have no extract remains the same. So for AQA, 25 marks, there's no extract, but a choice between two questions. These were the most recent. Examine the significance of the relationship between Blanche and Stella in the play, or examine the significance of music and songs in A Streetcar Named Desire. You choose one. You have about an hour, and in Edexcel slightly more, about an hour and 15 minutes to write, and that's it. You have a blank copy of the texts. You can't bring any notes in. If you're relying on that blank copy of the text, that will be wasting some of your time that you have to write a 5-paragraph essay. Edexcel, again, no extract, but a choice between the questions. Explore William's use of stagecraft. So that means the ideas about this being a play. So, for example, the setting, the dialogue, the stage directions, etc. In A Streetcar Named Desire, you must relate your discussion to relevant contextual factors. That means you have to include context that reminding you of that. Or explore how Williams presents the relationship between Blanche and Mitch in A Streetcar Named Desire. You must relate your discussion to relevant contextual factors. So again, relationships or an idea from the text, a theme from the text, a relationship in the text, right? The significance of something, usually, is the phrasing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce to you Tennessee Williams, who is our playwright or playwriter today. And what I want you to do is put anything into the chat that stands out to you, any questions you have, anything you'd like me to explain in a little bit more detail. As you'll notice above me in blue, I've pulled out the major themes of Williams' work across his texts, which means that these are not just themes that appear in A Streetcar Named Desire, but rather in most of his texts. And a quote from Elia Kazan, who was the director of the first Broadway version of A Streetcar Named Desire and worked with Tennessee Williams very closely for many of his works, and also was the director for the film version with Marlon Brando and Vivian Leigh, over which Tennessee Williams had a certain amount of pull because he was doing the scene writing and the script writing for it. Okay, so I'm going to read anything that stands out to you. Perhaps one of the most famous playwrights of the 20th century, Thomas Lanier Williams III was born in Columbus, Mississippi, to a working-class traveling shoe salesman and a middle-class singing teacher. His father was often away from home and suffered with alcoholism. Williams has described his father as a violent man with a turbulent temper, which led to the upheaval of the family several times during Williams' childhood. Williams grew up for the most part in his maternal grandparents' house, a rectory for the parish over which his grandfather presided. His father was a pastor or a Christian religious leader. Williams suffered a nearly fatal bout of diphtheria as a child, which left him sickly and frail for most of his life and required him to be kept at home for almost 2 years. His mother, a sudden belle, struggling with an unhappy, and that's quotes from Williams himself, and abusive marriage, doted on him. His sister, Rose, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She was subjected to a lobotomy and was institutionalized in different mental health facilities for the majority of her life, from basically the time Williams himself was at university. Williams had a close relationship with her and supported her life in a private facility as an adult. So when he had earned and achieved fame and success, he paid for his sister's facility so that she was in a private facility rather than a state-funded one. Some believed that his own use of alcohol and drugs was partly in response to the traumatic experience surrounding his sister's institutionalization, which Williams often cited was unfair, unnecessary, unneeded, and his fear of becoming mentally unwell in a similar way. He also struggled with his sexuality in a time in which overt homosexuality could be punished, met with violence, or serve as a cause for institutionalization or painful treatments. That being said, Williams was always open about his sexuality as a gay man, but obviously that manifested slightly different than it might do today because of the fear of repercussions that were very real for him and for many at the time. During his junior year of university, he was taken out of university by his father and put to work. Williams worked at several menial jobs before he was able to make a living from writing, including working as a factory worker, a job which partially influenced the character of Stanley Kowalski, who we'll soon meet, a caretaker on a chicken farm, and a sales clerk for a shoe company, actually the shoe company his father worked at. The difficulties he found working at these jobs led to an emotional breakdown at age 24, but led him to rededicate himself to his writing, for which he adopted the nom de plume Tennessee in reference to his southern background. His father was from Tennessee. It was only at 33, with the publication of The Glass Menagerie, that Williams achieved true fame. This fame became stratospheric with the publication of A Streetcar Named Desire 2 years later. He was awarded later a Pulitzer Prize for his work, which is one of the highest awards one can win as a writer. Though Williams achieved great success in the theatre during his career, it was the film versions of his play that have immortalized his play for future generations. It's likely you will see this if you're studying this play. It's likely you will see this at some point, this play, in your lessons, or you'll be commissioned to go and see it outside of school hours. Despite this success, Williams' private life was turbulent. He suffered addiction to barbiturates, amphetamines, and alcohol, and several times plummeted into deep depressions that led to severe hospitalizations and time spent in mental health facilities. Turbulent and often abusive relationships with men throughout his life also led to unhappiness and difficulty for him both personally and professionally. These difficulties continued until his death. Williams was found dead in a hotel room and is believed to have died of an overdose of barbiturates. This is a little bit contested at this point, but has been concluded along these lines. He asked in his will that he be buried at sea as close as possible to the place in which Hart Crane, another poet and friend and inspiration of Williams's, committed suicide on the Brooklyn Bridge and left almost his entire estate to his sister Rose. The main themes in Williams' work: poverty, appearance versus reality, class and poverty, so really the institutional levels of poverty in particularly the working class, decay and decline, change, lies, deception and the truth, sexuality, desire and repression, violence and brutality, the American South, mental disorientation and emotional breakdowns and dissociation from reality. So as Kazan says, everything in his life is in his plays and everything in his plays is in his life. So it is very easy to conclude that we can say characters such as Blanche are semi-autobiographical. In fact, many critics have associated the character of Blanche in particular with both Tennessee Williams' own self and with the characterization of his mother, who was also this sort of larger-than-life character for him, who is very similar to Blanche in her background as well as perhaps in terms of her mental health, as we shall see. And this is our introduction to the play itself. It was first performed in 1947. Its most famous film version in 1951 features Vivien Leigh as Blanche and Marlon Brando as Stanley, directed by Elia Kazan with Williams as producer. Now, this is our shorter summary. We'll get into a much longer and more detailed summary in our next lesson. But for now, this is the story of the play. So apologies for the spoilers, but if you're reading this for A-level, you'll need to know the ending at some point, because we'll need to talk about the whole play in order to talk about these characters and their trajectories. So, Blanche Dubois arrives to Elysium Fields in post-war New Orleans to stay with her younger married sister Stella, who's expecting her first child. The sisters have not seen each other in several years and are shown to be very different. Blanche clings to the old world values of the antebellum South's high society, while Stella is much more engaged with the gritty modern life in New Orleans. Immediately, Blanche and Stanley Kowalski, Stella's husband, clash, as it is clear that they have very different backgrounds and values. One point of contention is the sale of Belle Reve, Blanche and Stella's family home, a large but decaying plantation estate in Mississippi that Stella left years ago, and about which Blanche is bitter, devastated, and elusive. Tensions between Blanche and Stanley build over money, alcohol, lifestyle, and Blanche's excessive bathing, and Stella tries to keep the peace. Through this, Blanche is revealed to be condescending, demanding, and secretly drinking, and Stanley is revealed to be brutal, controlling, and very overtly sexual. Meanwhile, Blanche becomes interested in Mitch, one of Stanley's poker-playing friends, and a suspicious Stanley attempts to investigate Blanche's account of rich and influential beaux waiting to whisk her away, beaux or boyfriends. On Blanche's birthday, Stella throws her a small party. Here, Stanley reveals that his present is a bus ticket back to Mississippi, and also reveals that Blanche has been fired from her teaching position for inappropriate liaisons with an underage student and was living in a hotel, possibly as a sex worker, before running out of money and coming to stay with Stella. Stanley also reveals that he has told this information to Mitch, which is why Mitch has not arrived for the dinner. An argument ensues, and Stella, going into early labor, is rushed to the hospital. In a later scene, Mitch arrives to confront Blanche and attempts to rape her before leaving angrily. Stanley returns to the apartment, drunk and savagely happy about the birth of his son, comes home and encounters Blanche, who is drunk and in a dissociative state. Stanley overpowers Blanche, and it is suggested that he rapes her. A doctor and nurse arrive to take Blanche to an institution. It appears that she has suffered a complete breakdown after the rape, and she now cannot separate reality from fantasy. Stella sadly watches her sister being taken away, unable to believe Blanche's account of the rape. What are your initial reactions to the plot? Pop into the chat. Any reaction? Shock? Horror? Curiosity? What have we got? Take a moment just to put any thoughts you have so far. It's often that people have this kind of frustrated shock at the events of the play because it seems that from the start everything's going to go wrong. This clash between these two different characters, Blanche and Stanley, is too much for them all to coexist in this tiny apartment in the sweltering heat of a summer in New Orleans. And all of these characters, influenced by alcohol and heat and frustration and complications, misunderstandings, and just completely different backgrounds, cannot find a resolution. There is this sort of clashing of worlds that takes place here, with Stella, who is once in one world and now in another, caught in the crosshairs between these two fixed figures of Stanley and Blanche. And with this, truth comes out. Everything is revealed. Baser instincts are taking over, and sadly we end in this violent and destructive assault that leads to Blanche's destruction and her being taken away by a doctor and a nurse, presumably to an institution. So you can already see the influence of William's own experiences here, his fears of being institutionalized, his sister's institutionalization and dissociation from reality, and his mother's as well. This tension between his violent father and his Southern belle or upper class mother, who had this unhappy marriage, and this conflict that all takes place in the Deep South, a Deep South that's rooted in this history of conflict and this newly emerging upper class and middle class structure. Then what predictions do you have on a play, one of whose quotations is, "I don't want realism, I want magic. Yes, yes, magic. I try to give that to people. I misrepresent things to them. I don't tell truths. I tell what ought to be the truth." Immediately here, we have a rejection of reality. A rejection of reality. We have this desire for fantasy. What is magic? Magic is fantasy, is escape, is excitement, is glamour, is, the unlikely, the unexpected, particularly in a positive way rather than a negative way of the horror of. And this, I try to give that to people. I misrepresent that. So that immediately becomes a little bit trickier, right? I try to give that to people. That means passing on this magic rather than realism. So this idea of transaction then, of inheritance, of communication. And then this complicates even more with this sense of misrepresenting things, because this suggests this idea of lying, really. And ambiguity, 100%, Zemi. fantasy becoming pulled into reality. This idea of confusion, lines blurred, and liminal spaces. What's real, what's not? Appearance versus reality. But also with that, because it's all well and good to think about things like that, we also have the negative side of that, right? We have deceit. We have deception. We have manipulation. We have trickery, right? We have obfuscation, which means hiding things on purpose, blurring things on purpose. I don't tell truths, I tell what ought to be the truth. Here, then, we have tension. Because who has this power? This is about power, right? This is about reality and different realities. Today, we might call it fake news versus reality versus actual falsehood, right? These different layers of what is true and what is not, that really creates this destabilization as we don't know what's true anymore. And this really becomes clear in the stagecraft as well as in the characters of A Streetcar Named Desire. Lights change, lights are hidden and covered and revealed. Veils are cast over the past and over lamps and over different people. Rhinestones seem like diamonds but are revealed to be rhinestones. There's all this sort of tension and interaction between the two, which means that we're really setting ourselves up for not being comfortable and not being able to see the truth and not being able to trust. And that's really the, I wouldn't say necessarily scary part, but certainly the destabilizing part of this play is you don't know what's real. We're not even sure that Stanley rapes Blanche, what happened to Belle Rev, what happened with Mitch and Stanley when it was revealed about their conversation all off stage. We see so little really that it's frustrating. Here are our characters. These in blue are our major characters, and then the dramatis personae is the full list of characters. So you can see there's not a huge amount more. Blanche arguably is our protagonist because really the play starts and ends with her. In terms of her arrival, she's not the first character on stage, but it is her arrival that to a certain extent catalyzes the play, and it's her departure at the end that finishes it and concludes it. Stella is her sister who's married to Stanley. Stella and Blanche grew up together in Mississippi, in Laurel, at Belle Rev. And then at a certain point, Stella left Belle Rev for good and moved to New Orleans. We don't know if that was with or without Stanley. We do know that they're married now in this very physical, loving, but also powerful dynamic that includes physical abuse as well as an extremely important sexuality to their relationship. Stanley is a working class immigrant from whose family is from Poland. He is a worker. He's dressed as in working clothes, in blue collar clothes, literally, and is very uncouth. He's very, very masculine. He is very gruff. He's very physical. He's kind of this tough guy who is very much not playing into the manners and charms that Blanche has used to get through life. So they're very much at tension, at odds, and Stella's between them as being aware of both of these worlds. Eunice Hubble is the upstairs neighbor of Stella and Stanley, who has a similar relationship with her husband as Stella and Stanley do, in that it is intensely passionate, but also abusive, loud, volatile, and resorts to physical violence. It seems that that is normalized for the characters in the play, so they don't necessarily question its right or wrongness to the extent that we do as readers, but it seems as though she echoes and magnifies what happens with Stella in her relationship in an older and longer established relationship with her husband Steve. Then we also have, as has been mentioned in the summary, Mitch, or Harold Mitchell, who is one of Stanley's friends. They served in the war together. It's the Second World War, and they've been friends for a long time. He plays poker with Stanley. He has a sick mother, and he falls for this kind of gentle wiles of Blanche, though we'll see, not permanently. Other than this, we've got a couple of friends of Stanleys who come to play poker. So, for example, Pablo. We have a doctor and matron at the end who come to take Blanche away. We have a young man who Blanche attempts to seduce when he is collecting subscriptions for the newspaper. And we have a Mexican woman and also other assorted street vendors who aren't necessarily on stage, really. The Mexican woman is, but the other street vendors on stage are just voices calling, selling their wares in the street and adding to the din of this noisy, busy street and apartment. And the Mexican woman in particular sells flores para los muertos, which is flowers for the dead, presumably for either a nearby cemetery or for the celebration of Day of the Dead in November. These are the major characters. We have Blanche, as I said, who is upper class and is an elitist. She thinks of herself as better than Stanley, as someone who is completely removed from him. She likes fantasy. So she is the one who said that quote. She is clinging to the old world and to her old life. And as we can see as well from the summary, she is the secret alcoholic who's attempted to escape the past while also cling to it. And she is extremely dependent in many ways on alcohol, in terms of financially, on men, on others to validate her, etc. We have Stella as well. Stella, who is the younger sister, but seemingly the more mature one. And she's much more understanding than Blanche. She tries to justify Blanche's behavior to Stanley and Stanley's behavior to Blanche. She's kind of this peacekeeper between. And she's caught between these two worlds. But as we also know, she is pregnant, which means that this is going to add another element of this next generation, right? If we're thinking about women being pregnant in plays or in literature, there is, of course, a different and an extra additional meaning rather than just the biology of it. We also have Stanley. Stanley is, as he says himself, this kind of unrefined character in quotations. He is working class, which defines him. He is quite a brutal character as well. he is particularly, as we've seen with Blanche, he is deeply masculine as well, and he has this immigrant element to his identity that is also defining because it is part of our understanding of him as this new class that develops within the post-war era. We also have him as aligned particularly with poker, with bowling, with drinking. These kind of games of chance, games of skill, etc., and with lurid colours. So he is often associated with colours, whereas Blanche is associated with white, always wearing white, diamonds, tiaras, etc. We'll get much more into them going forwards, don't you worry. But for now, these are the major themes of the play, and this is having looked back at all of the different resources that you may commonly go to, as well as the different exam boards and previous exams. Excuse me. So how they've phrased them. Change, sexuality and desire, fantasy and delusion, identity. Think how many ideas that will cover. Love and marriage, masculinity, femininity, friendship, violence, decay, corruption, self-deception and deception, disillusionment, fear, power, class, time, poverty, truth and lies and deception, and fragility and mental turbulence. So we've got so many different ideas at play here. Could you group some of these under one subheading? For sure, but definitely important to think about all the different manifestations of a similar idea can appear. Then we have the setting, and of course we're going to get more into this going forward as well, and particularly when we come back to different themes. But the settings for now, we have Elysium Fields is the neighborhood to which Blanche arrives at the beginning of the play and in which the entire play is set. And this neighborhood is served by the Desire streetcar line, which is a real streetcar line that was in New Orleans at the time. And you can see this is what a streetcar is, a kind of subway, but it's above ground, so it's trolley. It's also set in New Orleans, of course. Within New Orleans is Elysium Fields, which is itself a multicultural city of both aristocratic history. So think the French Quarter, the oldest quarter or the oldest neighborhood in New Orleans, founded in 1718 by French colonists. So very much one of the oldest and most established neighborhoods in America, really. And as well as the post-war industry, its location on the Mississippi River and its proximity to the Gulf of Mexico means that it was a key trading post for ships to come into, for ships to come out of, for distribution as a port. And the available land as well in the South, especially after the rise of plantations, was to establish factories and plants and big workhouses there, something on which the southern economy still depends. Then we have the Kowalski's first floor apartment, this cramped two-bedroom first floor apartment in the French Quarter of New Orleans in 1947. So we have again this contrast between this tiny apartment and Belle Rêve, which is their lost family home. We don't see it. We have descriptions of it as a white place with big columns in the country. It was a plantation style big house in Laurel, Mississippi that is described as fine in its heyday, fine being really nice, grand, but has since fallen into disrepair due to the lack of money and harsh creditors, as well as the suggested to be tragic early deaths of many Dubois relatives. In fact, Blanche says that the land that their family owned has been reduced basically by the time it was lost to the house and the cemetery next to it, and that was it. So clearly, a lot of the grandeur of Belle Reve has been lost over the generations, and we're going to look at some of that context in a minute. Then what symbolic purposes might these settings serve? Well, firstly, we've got this juxtaposition between these two settings here. We've got juxtaposition between these two in terms of what that tells us about the class of the characters, their experience of poverty, as well as where they are in time. So Belle Reve belongs to the past, whereas the Kowalskis is this current, thrumming, modern life. And New Orleans as well has the same tension of history and modernity. And then Elysium Fields, that might sound recognizable to you, and that is because Elysium Fields is the name for one of the places in the afterlife in Greek mythology. So you crossed over the river Styx, and Hades and Cerberus decided where it was you were going in the afterlife. Tartarus is hell. Elysium Fields is this kind of semi-heaven in which people lulled around in this kind of happy forgetfulness. So it was like they were just calm and sensationless in a way. They were just happy, all their worries were taken away, etc. Does this sound like the kind of place that Stanley, Stella, and Blanche are inhabiting? No. But it is indicative of this link they have with death, and death in the neighborhood being linked to desire. Being linked here to desire. So desire and death being symbolically linked immediately, because it is through this setting, arriving in Elysium Fields, having taken the Desire streetcar, that Blanche arrives to this apartment. So immediately she is associated, and her desire, her sexuality, her femininity, and her way of life are all associated and aligned with death from the start. So this play is really her journey towards death and destruction. She's already on it as a result of her past, as we'll see, and as a result of who she actually embodies as part of the Old South. But it's clear that she is moving towards death and destruction as she's associated with it. And Stanley and Stella, the people who are able to adapt and thrive in this new world, especially having a baby and continuing in that way in this new world, are the ones who survive. Now, context-wise, what have we got? We've got that A Streetcar Named Desire was set and first performed in 1947 in America, a place whose zeitgeist was defined by the Great Depression and World War II, which led to major changes for American societal structure, especially in the South, as a largely agrarian and impoverished area became a more diverse urban and industrial area. So this means that all of these different world events led to what was previously a farming rural background becoming much more an urban area, so cities, and people moving for the first time in generations from farmland to cities. A disruption to previously established class hierarchies as a result of heavy losses from World War II. So there was a disruption to the way things were because there were so many absences in this, and a kind of renegotiation of class with this great equalizer of war. We also have New Orleans being previously an extremely poor area with over 30% unemployment, which is extremely significant. Politicians and government leaders attempt to keep poverty in a single-digit percentage. The establishment of factories, plants, and military bases during World War II led to this boom, and thousands of women, black people, and new immigrants from Central and South America, so hence the name of one of Stanley's friends, Pablo, able to find jobs often for the first time. Similarly, raw materials of the South like cotton, oil, fruit, and livestock that were grown and produced in the South meant that these factories, having them in proximity to the places where they're grown, makes sense, right? Because that's less transport. So these factories were built in the same place, means they were able to convert into consumer production after the war, so maintain the South's new dominant economic position. So previously, plantations then sent their raw goods up to the North. The North had the factories. Now the South could stay and keep its own wealth in the South rather than really impoverishing itself by giving all of the money to the North. This idea of new money, so factory ownership, manufacturing wealth newly accrued, began to rival old money, which was land ownership, benefiting from sharecropping and wealth amassed from enslavement, which it is believed that Stella and Blanche's family's wealth originally stemmed from owning slaves. Urban migration led to the mass exodus from plantations and rural areas and newly overpopulated dense urban areas, as I said. And then the emergence of second wave feminism in the post-war period, only very freshly starting in the time this was written, but certainly burgeoning as time went on, in which women advocated for equal power in society and strained against newly reimposed gender norms after men returned from war. So there was much more need for women in work and outside of the domestic sphere during the war because men were en masse going to war and seemingly not returning. And then when men returned from the war, women were fired from their jobs that they had taken over and were expected to go back to the home and be wife and mother again only. Women, you can imagine, chafed at this. Then we have the Old South. So 18th century French colonizers, 1700s. Established New Orleans as a key port that became an epicenter of trade for cotton and other plantation goods due to its key positioning on waterways. An economy in the South based on agriculture, particularly cotton, meant that many migrated to work on plantations owned by powerful and influential landowners. Society consequently became divided into three distinct classes. Planter class, which is landowners who profited from goods grown on plantations, often considered southern aristocracy. So this would be Blanche and Stella's family. Plain folk, so workers who served in professions and in factories. This would be Stanley. And hill people, which was rural enclaves which often had limited access to urban resources, so named as many of these communities were based in the Appalachian Mountains. So these were people who weren't necessarily in the same dynamic, but were certainly ostracized to a certain extent in these class hierarchies. Gender and race also determine one's position in society. Thus, while Stella was born to a higher class than Stanley, his masculinity still ensures his dominance over her. So there is that class tension again, but ultimately Stanley wins over. The values of the Old South included a strict emphasis on manners and courtesy, class and good breeding, Christian values, patriotism, and a glorification of old Southern values, especially those remembered nostalgically by the aristocracy from the antebellum era, the time preceding the American Civil War. So this means that people wanted to go back to the South before the Civil War, forgetting seemingly the devastating effects that it had for enslaved people, because they wanted to go back to this kind of genteel, simpler golden era as it was described, and these values reinforced that and promoted that, whereas clearly that was not an option to return. Cotterill describes that this glorification of the antebellum South erased the devastating consequences of enslavement for Black Americans and instead highlighted the ruin done to the South in terms of its power, land, hierarchy, and values. And we can see resonances of this still in some historical texts. The emphasis on gentility in tandem with the Second and Third Great Awakenings, these are religious movements, led to an increase in conservatism, especially around socially taboo subjects such as women's chastity, moderation, and temperance, which means not having in excesses. And what was viewed as the modern social ills of alcohol, pornography, and sex work. So it was this kind of reintroduction to religious values that were meant to resist what people thought of as the bad things about modern life, which was, for example, alcohol, pornography, and sex work. And you don't think the olden days was simpler in your opinion? 100% agree. It's just that people forget about it and get nostalgic for a past that didn't really exist the way they remember it. Now, the New South. So this is Cotterill again in blue. Since the people of the New South, looking around them, saw nothing even remotely resembling it, the nostalgically imagined Old South, they reasoned quite logically that it must have died. There were some people then who viewed the development of manufacturing as a surrender of Southern ideals and the adoption of a low Yankee culture. Here, Yankee means someone from the north of America who is the opposition in the Civil War to the South. So this idea of thinking that, okay, why is there a New South? Looking back, it must have been because we changed entirely as a society. Something has died. That means that we have this new way of living now. Is that the case? Arguable, I would say no. But this idea of people thinking they'd lost their way, that they lost their culture. So the New South was the period which became known as the New South began to develop during the Industrial Revolution, as the availability of space to build factories and warehouses and the new technology of railroads led to the emergence of a class of new money capitalists, whose money derived from those new industries rather than from land ownership and aristocratic roots of the planter class. So suddenly there are new people who are on top with money and wealth. The Third Great Awakening also led to social reforms, including a widespread push for education for all. Thus, there was a push towards a more egalitarian society, which means more equal for everyone, in which anyone seemingly could become rich, powerful, and important. That seemingly is important because there were still institutional issues that kept people from those resources. The Immigration Act of 1924 led to restrictions of Eastern European and Mediterranean immigrants who had arrived in large waves of migrations since the 1890s. Stereotypes abounded about this newly arrived immigrant class who were viewed as dirty, uncivilized, and uncontrollable. In fact, they were often viewed as a different race from the white Americans who lived on the plantations, for example. However, New Orleans' relative proximity to Central and South America and its more diverse society that mixed white people, black people, more established French Creole culture, and new immigrants meant that it became a melting pot of different cultures. So all these cultures come together and mix perfectly happily. This is exemplified by the continuous presence of jazz, an art form established by Black Americans, and the socializing between a white and black woman in conversation at the start of the play. Williams' own stage directions in Act 1, Scene 1, described that New Orleans is a cosmopolitan city where there is a relatively warm and easy intermingling of races in that old part of town. Okay. So, what have we got for Williams' own choices? We have, for example, him saying, I think of all my plays have had, subliminally at least, a great deal of social content. So here we have Williams himself thinking about the value and the purpose of his work. So this idea of social content, he then is attempting to comment on society through his plays. Certainly he is talking about class, certainly he is talking about gender, and certainly he is talking about sexuality in this play. To a lesser extent, he is also commenting a little bit on race and on cultural changes more broadly than those, but those are his main ideas. Coming from a working class background, but with a mother who is higher class, not necessarily as high class as Blanche and Stella would have been, but certainly as a Southern belle, aspiring to aristocracy. Tennessee Williams seemingly witnessed this tension between classes in his own life. And growing up and living in the South and living in New Orleans himself, he could definitely see the changes that were taking place in the time. And having lived through the wars himself as well, was engaging in this tumultuous time that seemed to be redefining who and what success looked like in this new world that was existing now. With this as well, we've got Williams saying that consequently I'm not a political person except that I'm a revolutionary. Now, on what side? That's hard to say, because many of his characters are complicatedly sympathetic. So if we read Blanche and Stella with a feminist lens, they certainly are sympathetic. Seems that most people find Blanche a sympathetic character. But if we read the play with a Marxist lens, so in terms of looking at the class specifically, then we think of Blanche and to a lesser extent Stella being these symbols of the old-fashioned oppressor class, these planter people who have dominated society for too long and are now dying out, and for whom Stanley is actually the hero, because he, and particularly his ability to marry into this and have a baby with Stella, means that he has made it as part of the American dream. He has integrated into American society, he has made something of himself, and he has cast off the oppressive residue of the upper classes. So what can we say that Williams is saying here? Perhaps he's trying to critique the class structures, either those that existed at the time or those that that were uplifting and uprooting, more so uprooting than uplifting, I would say, those old-fashioned ways of doing things. Could it be to educate? Could it be to highlight? Could it be to warn? It's hard to say, right? For each of your paragraphs, I'm sure you'll have a slightly different idea as to what William's intention is, because his intention isn't an idea that you tack on at the end of a paragraph, but rather link specifically to a specific character's choices, or to a symbol's appearance, or to the interpretation of a theme which you are tracking across a play. Excuse me. So what do we have left to organize then? We have to think about what's important here for our knowledge before we go. Well, firstly, we have our A-level key information. So we have this more in-depth study of literature. We have the need to develop arguments. We have this analysis of patterns across the text. And how meanings are shaped. We certainly have these AO1 through AO3 and AO5 assessment objectives. We have this necessity with AO5 to include criticism in our work. So thus this idea of in-depth as well as reading around. We also have how many marks this question is, right? That's important for us to know going in. With no extract, choice of questions, and a blank copy of the text. Okay, so if you've got those in your notes, that's great. If you have more ideas, you've been copying down every word I've said, great as well, but these are the key pieces of information we need here. With Tennessee Williams himself, we've got, for example, his own Southern background. We've got his alcoholic father. We've got his Southern Belle mother. We've got their abusive relationship, as Tennessee Williams himself described it, unhappy. We've got his sister's lobotomy and institutionalization. We've got his own fear of mental health issues. And his abuse of alcohol and drugs. We've got his three key plays of The Glass Menagerie, A Streetcar Named Desire, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. The latter two won him Pulitzer Prizes. Hello, IGCSE, welcome. We know that A Streetcar Named Desire was one of his three most successful plays. He struggled with addiction all his life, etc. But we get this, probably some of our ideas about his key themes. Class, violence, appearance versus reality, disillusionment, and the South. Then really captures quite a lot of this. If you want to include Kazan's quotation as well, feel free to. But these are the key ideas. And then plot, characters, and setting. We've got, to start, Blanche Dubois. We've got Stella. And we've got Stanley Kowalski. We've got Mitch. We've got the fact that the setting is in Elysium Fields. And there are these two different mini settings of the apartment versus Belle Reve, which we know does not appear, but is an important setting for us as well. We've got the trajectory of these characters in which Blanche arrives, tension with her and Stanley. The truth is revealed about her past, and Stanley's true colors are revealed as well. She is raped, and that leads to her destruction. Right? In simplest terms, that is the plot. Blanche dies, Stella survives. It's implied because she's adopted this new way of living. She's accepted the new way of life. She's married into it. She's giving birth to this new generation. And that is how we move on. Then for the Old South versus the New South, let's make this like a T-chart. Here we've got antebellum values. We've got nostalgia for pre-Civil War era. We've got this Southern aristocracy. The planter class to which Blanche and Stella would belong to. We would have got this dependent on land ownership. We would have had conservatism, this largely rural setting. Right. And then the new American South, we have new money class. We've got factories, railroads, basically technology upsetting these different ways of life. We've got waves of immigrants. In this melting pot of New Orleans, we've got a urban developments as people move to cities and towards cities. If we think about these as our new industries, we've got this new emergence of a working class who is not enslaved and thus able to advocate more for their rights, empowered to advocate for their rights. And this working class consciousness that was starting to develop and pride in this identity. Certainly. And that really covers it as well, thinking about the Old South versus these new values, but also these new social ills. So changes in hierarchies, in terms of class as well as gender and race, immigrants becoming more accepted, certainly stereotypes still abounding, etc. But suddenly there was a new, more powerful class in town who previously had not had access to power. And then finally, how can we think about implementing this into our own work? Well, if we're thinking about how to incorporate context into our work, we need to think about the relationship between the text and the context. So, for example, does it reflect it? Does it capture it? Does it critique it? Does it question it? Does it highlight the differences between this new society and the one of Blanche, the dying Blanche? Up to you to say whichever phrasing you like, but thinking about incorporating this text into your analysis of the context is key. So if we think about the way we can write this up, I'm actually going to do this with typing instead. Then we can think about how we can incorporate this into our own work. So for example, Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire may reflect the zeitgeist of post-war American society because, first, we need to know what that means. The text may reflect the zeitgeist is the spirit of the age. So the cultural ideas, the cultural beliefs, the mainstream views and values of the time, especially of post-war American society. Well, what was going on in the post-war again? We've got a more egalitarian society. We've got more equal opportunities. We've got urban migration. We've got a boom in New Orleans because, for example, New Orleans as a newly powerful center of trade. See how it doesn't cut off. There we go. As a newly powerful center of trade, embodies the changes to Southern society and systems of power in post-war America, because it was this previously impoverished city that has now eclipsed the former centers of Southern power, such as plantations owned by the planter class. Thus, Stanley Kowalski is linked to the setting of New Orleans because he too embodies this newly burgeoning center of growth and innovation that seeks to replace the moribund values and power of Blanche and Belle Reve. Now, what's the value of this? Value of this is that we're linking New Orleans and the zeitgeist of post-war American society. So what happened to New Orleans after the war? Became this huge center of trade. Okay. That matches what was going on in the South more broadly, because this previously impoverished city has now taken power away from and is now more powerful than those old systems of power and control, i.e. the plantations. So Stanley, as well as the setting, they match all up because he also embodies these same ideas. So you can see how this analysis and this context really weave together. They don't stand out as one or the other and, oh, this is a context sentence and this is a character sentence, but rather that these implement each other. So we're noticing this pattern. Hey, setting, Stanley, context all match up. Let's bring them together and prove we know that. Same for another quotation or another way to implement this here by thinking, for example, as suggested by the play's setting, A Streetcar Named Desire captures a changing society in which lines of class division were being redrawn and newly established working classes bridled and chafed against the previously accepted hierarchies of power. Oops. This was never more clear than in the bustling and newly prosperous multicultural city of New Orleans, in which Stanley thrives and Blanche is destroyed. So again, a similar idea. I wouldn't say put these two ideas next to each other, but a different way to frame the same ideas we've looked at today. That these characters and these settings reflect something about what the author is trying to say as well, what the playwright is trying to say. That class is being redefined not just in the play, but also in society. And this is made clear because the setting is New Orleans, where this was actually happening at the same time. Then finally, and I'm aware we only have a minute or two left to us, I can show you how we can talk specifically about Blanche in this final line where we say, anxieties around the post-war changes to social hierarchies may be reflected in William's presentation of Blanche. And let's do that. As a decadent and exiled socialite struggling against the tides of modernity that threaten to drown not only her, but the values and culture of the moribund Old South. If you wanted to talk about Stanley, you could do the same thing, but flip it around so that it's Stanley thriving as a result of his aggressively brash and overtly masculine character, because that was the kind of character that was able to survive and thrive in the post-war period with this renegotiation of gender roles and this emergence of a new immigrant working class who did have a voice in society and could wield it with devastating effects for those who were still clinging to old systems of power, like Blanche. What do you think? Any questions? Feel free to put in the chat. I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, we have come to the end of our lesson, but we will have another lesson same time next week. 6:50 to 8:20 on Wednesdays is our time for you to have these lessons completely for free. They're also available in perpetuity for you on YouTube so that you are able to access them as you need them for revision or for mocks preparation or just for inspiration as you're thinking about how to improve your own work and how to make your work just a little bit more challenging and more in depth going forwards. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. Anaya, thank you very much. See you next time. Bye for now, everyone. Bye.